You're moving again. You have to click got it though.
Yes, that's right. So I have to accept that this is being filmed.
Okay. Madelon.
Great. Well, nice to meet you all. Also online. Thanks for joining, for being here. Yeah, my name is Madelon Hulsebos. I'm indeed a PhD student at University of Amsterdam while I work at Sigma Computing. And today I will be talking about GitTables, which is a large-scale repository of relational tables that we extracted from GitHub. Oh, I need to accept this. Yeah, okay. So I worked on this project in 2021 together with Chartai Demirald from Sigma Computing as well, and Paul Grove, my supervisor from the University of Amsterdam. And in short, today I will be explaining why we built GitTables, how we actually did that, and what we now have and what we can do with it. Please feel free also to interrupt, ask questions along the way.
Can you once again pronounce the first name of
Chartai. Chartai.
Chartai,
yeah,
okay, now
Chartai.
I should know that. Okay, thank you.
Chartai, yeah. At least that's how I pronounce it. So,
Okay.
but I think it's okay, it's accurate. Okay, so let's start with why we actually need table corpora in the first place. So I think we've all seen over the past decades that machine learning models have become excellent in understanding images, videos, natural language. Nowadays with Copilot, for example, we even can complete code. Maybe you use it, maybe you don't. But when it comes to tables, which carry a lot of structured information, we are not so good at understanding them yet and also modeling them. So of course, we use table corpora for building such models. And these table models can be very effective for applications like data search, data integration, data validation as well, but also for query optimization, for example, cardinality estimation, validation, and also query recommendations, if you will. Some great corpora are around. Web tables, for example, there are different corpora of web tables actually, and these corpora are actually all tables extracted from HTML pages. While we also have wiki tables, and as the name implies, these tables are extracted from Wikipedia pages. And these corpora are very large and very effective already for these applications. But well, we are not satisfied with such corpora. And that's because if we think about why these corpora are effective, well, they can be used for many web applications. For example, Q&A on Google, right? If you search for something on Google, you may see a table being returned because there is an answer hidden in it. But if we then consider data management tasks, and well, especially within like offline databases, it's much harder to actually generalize and bridge this gap between web table corpora and database tables. And that raises the questions like, are these web tables really representative for database tables? And Sherlock is a semantic type detection model that I worked on at MIT Media Lab in 2019 for understanding the column representation. So what do columns really reflect of tables? And the feedback that we got on that model is that actually these web table corpora that it was trained on didn't really generalize well to, for example, pharmaceutical companies. So there we learned that, well, actually they use very different types. So the semantics are very different. And also the underlying data characteristics differ, well, widely. And this is also, where the study from Langenecker and all, which is part of Karsten Binnick's team, they've also worked on transferability from web table corpora to, for example, the public BI benchmark, which I think is hosted at CWI. And they found also that it doesn't really generalize well. So I'm not sure if it's really visible here, but maybe you can see it better online. So if we now consider two example tables, this left one is a table extracted from the Web Tables paper from Caffarella et al. And there we see a table that's about US presidents, for example. That's very generally relevant table, which, well, we can actually search for. All of us may be interested in that. If we then consider the second table, which is actually the first hit when you query or where you search for example database table on Google. And we see that the semantics of such tables are just very specific to, for example, a crop company. And such tables with identifiers and all kinds of measurements and categorical data about crops, they may not be found often in the wild on web pages. So given the kind of semantic gap between tables that we find on web pages and tables that we find in typical databases, we wonder how we can actually bridge that gap. So what would we need from a table corpus that actually generalize much better? So we defined a few criteria. First, we need database-like tables in terms of content, but also structure. So for example, the semantics, but also the data types and the sizes of these tables should be more representative. We want this table corpus to be of large scale so that we can also train all kinds of table representation models at a very high scale. Coming to the third one, we need large amount of tables because we need very broad coverage so that we can apply these tables within the pharma domain, but also in other domains, for example, in crop agriculture world. And this is also why we come to the fourth criterion when it comes about the semantics of these tables. So we preferably want to have also some kind of metadata of these tables to actually learn these signals.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So under your first bullet point, like what do you want well, you want content and structure, you want tables basically.
Yeah.
But you say, okay, semantics, data types and size.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you also be interested in data distributions? Like the actual values, what's in there?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So I think that's what I mean with semantics. So we need that these values should be representative and generalized to values that you actually see in database tables. Mm-hmm. If that's, do you mean that with data distribution?
I thought with semantics that you meant that this would map to some kind of ontology class or ontology element. That's what I usually trigger when people say semantics.
Yeah, no, that's actually the third one where we want to map to an ontology. With semantics, I mean that the actual data that is inside these tables have meaning similar to what we find in databases. But indeed, I understand the association with ontologies, but this is just that, that we want, for example, these tables to contain IDs or kind of measurements that we find also in database tables. So that's more about the actual values and what is in it. Does it answer your question?
Yeah, please.
I see another question.
In similar lines. So you say you want something that is typical size of the database table. But what is the typical size of the database table?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think this is more coming from what we don't see in web tables, for example, because these are on average pretty small tables, which makes sense because they have to be presented on web pages. But in general, we see in database tables that they are much larger. And that's also, I think, relevant when you want to learn table representation models where you need to have a larger sample size, for example, to understand what these tables are about. So in that sense, these are just kind of indicators of what these tables should look like or are expected to look like. Not necessarily what we want this corpus to be like, but more like, okay, these should be somewhat similar. And this is how we capture similarity in a sense.
Maybe, if I would interpret that and rephrase it from my point, I would probably, for all these points and first bullet points, cover the similar spectrum as database content, table sizes, the data types are covered. Whereas, as you just said, web tables are usually in a corner, small, tiny, limited.
Yeah.
And there is a much broader spectrum. That's what you call similarity.
Yeah, yeah, indeed, yeah. But I mean, it's also very hard to define what database tables look like, and it's very broad and diverse in that sense. So some are very small actually, and some are pretty big. So, but at least this is how I think we characterize it for now. But definitely worth also trying to investigate what these actually look like. And I've done quite some searching online, and it's pretty hard to get to a study that's, you know, or models that show, you know, what these tables should look like, and also therefore hard to kind of review existing corpora in that sense, in that light. But yeah, this is an attempt to that. All right. So then we wondered, can we maybe use CSV files from GitHub to actually build this corpus? So I went to GitHub and specified this simple query looking for CSV files with the term ID. And that's also what database tables often have, like identifiers, for example. And what you see here in the second yellow box is that there are already almost 16 million tables or CSV files that contain, you know, the term ID. And that's already only for the ID topic. So in that sense, it covers the scale, it has the semantics, and yeah, table size, one downside of GitHub is that it restricts the file sizes that you can upload. But at least we have, you know, database-like tables, at least that's what how we characterize it. And also, if you look at this table that's shown here, this is actually the first example where you search for it back then, because this relies on indexing, of course. And this is actually what you probably can find in an Uber, you know, Uber-like platform in their databases. You see that it's much more numerical content, and yeah, I mean, attributes specified in headers that are also, yeah, make sense and that we find come across often, and which you don't see typically in web tables, for example. But I think Hannes can maybe, you know.
Web tables are a mess. This is much nicer.
Yeah.
I'm curiosity, how do you identify, how do you or GitHub identify CSV tables? Build an extension CSV?
Yeah, so this is only looking for, yeah, you can also look for different extensions, but this is pretty useful for, yeah, collecting such a corpus. Yeah, it's basically on the file extension. All right, so from why we build it and why we chose GitHub as our like data source, now to how we actually build it. So this is on a very high level. I'll get into the more details of each step. But on a high level, we first, of course, extract all the CSV files, and that's not that straightforward actually from GitHub. And then we parse these CSV files into tables, curate these tables, and annotate these tables with semantics from ontologies indeed, to facilitate tasks like data integration, for example. Now, starting with CSV extraction, the goal here is, of course, to get as many CSV files as possible. And as said, this is not very straightforward because GitHub has all kinds of restrictions to reduce the load on their APIs. And one of these restrictions is that you have to specify a topic. So you cannot just, well, it turns out you can actually search for example, a comma or a dot, maybe even a space, and then you will probably get all CSV files. But we also segment it using actual topics informed by WordNet. So we take all 67-something thousand topics from WordNet to guide these queries. For each topic, we then, you know, create an initial query and fire that to GitHub, but we are also restricted in the response limit. So per query, you can only get 1,000 files. So you have to segment these queries further. And that's, well, we do that with the size qualifier. So I made an approximation of the file sizes of all files, well, not all files, but a sample of files on GitHub. And according to that distribution, we segment each topic query so that it is proportional to this distribution. So for example, for ID, we have 16 million tables or CSV files, more or less. And then we have like thousands of queries for only the ID topic, while for a very specific topic, dwarf comes to my mind. That's also in our corpus, and because of WordNet, there we have much less files, so we have much larger file ranges that we query, hence also less queries to execute. This is on approximation, so that per quarter we have roughly 1,000 files. Of course, we keep on, extracting these files until we have all files, hopefully, but that's a question mark at the moment. Then a bit unfortunate, but probably also a good thing, when we released the first version of GitTables, Copilot was also released. And you've probably seen the discussion around, well, is it very ethical to just, learn these models from all code, even though those repositories might not have been licensed? And well, to kind of the feedback on GitTables was also, okay, you can just, release all these tables and just leave them there. So what about these repository licenses? So we also filter CSV files based on permissive licenses. It's a bit of a gray area because these repositories are licensed, but not all these files separately. So we don't exactly know what we can and cannot publish, but at least we make an attempt to do this in the most responsible way. So we we filter out CSV files that come from repositories without a permissive license. The current version of GitTables is unfiltered in this sense, but our next release will be with only licensed CSV files.
And that will be 1/4 of the size then. Okay.
Yeah, but we'll get there in the end, but there are like 90 million CSV files already on GitHub. So still with 25%, we have a pretty reasonable size for this corpus. Yeah, then the second step, parsing tables and curating the actual set of tables that we are eager to publish and publish safely. So first we take a very simple approach to parsing CSV files to tables, just using the pandas CSV parser, for example, assuming that the header is on the first row. Of course, we manually reviewed this, and very often for these CSV files, that's actually the case. Maybe because it's a convention, but of course, there's also some messy, files that don't cohere to this convention. So we need to do some curation to filter those tables out. We filter out tables with social media data because we don't want to publish tables with potentially offensive content from Twitter, for example. So we filter out tables where a column name contains tweet or Twitter or Facebook. We are not simply interested in that. And we also substitute the potentially PII data, so personal identifiable information using Faker. So based on the column name, we try to understand if this is like personal information. If so, we substitute, for example, email addresses with fake email addresses. Overall, there's not much of such data. And hopefully, yeah, we don't distort the underlying data distributions with that. But yeah, we are limited to learn from actual email addresses because they are fake, but they are still email addresses. So that seems not a problem. Third step, and that's the last step actually, is to annotate these tables with column semantics. So we are very interested in, for example, mapping columns of names, email addresses, and addresses to an ontology to normalize these headers across different tables. We want to do that because, for example, for data integration, you may want to map different tables to each other, but it doesn't work if these headers are specified in a different way. So you need to have some kind of normalized ontology to actually infer semantics and use it for example, data integration. We use the ontologies and types from dbpedia and schema.org, very well-known ontologies. And this also helps actually for knowledge-based lookups, for example. This is useful for example, data validation. When you know that a column should contain countries, you can actually check if indeed these, the types and the data types, but also the actual values are consistent with what you would expect. But this is also interesting for example, data augmentation. If you have missing values, you can use these semantic types to actually substitute and fill in these gaps. These types also come with hierarchical relations. So, for example, if you have a table with product IDs based on schema.org, you can infer that these product IDs belong to a higher superclass IDs. And that's also how you can teach models to make this to learn these relationships between different columns that are still very similar. But for example, then you can penalize these models less for confusing product IDs versus IDs in comparison to, for example, misclassifying a column as addresses versus IDs, which are semantically much further apart. We enrich these tables with these semantics based on two methods, very simple. First, syntactic matching. So for example, if we have a column with the email with a capital, then we can just, we very easily clean these column names by all characters to lowercase, filtering out hyphens, underscores, and so on. Then we match it to all types in our ontology. And with that, have a very high quality annotation of these tables. And that's very useful actually, because for example, for videos and images, you don't have that kind of description of these objects. Well, for table columns, we actually have that because probably humans have actually been involved in describing these columns as being names or emails. So that's really useful. But we also look at, for example, a bit of meaning of these column names versus the types in our ontology by using a pre-trained language model, fast text in our case. So we basically embed all these column names with this model. We embed all types in our ontology and then do some mapping based on the cosine distance. Then we select the most accurate match there. But of course, the quality of the semantic annotation is lower because you make more mistakes. Questions about the how, because we will move on now to what we have and some use cases.
Well, I mean, I would expect the quality of this to be still relatively low. Well, first a remark, like if your ontologies are relatively kind of standard and they they are kind of generic, I assume, because you can have generic ontologies, but you can also have, but you probably don't have, very, very specific ontologies. If somebody would make an ontology that's very specific, but like if you have a company making paint or whatever, then you have very specific concepts in your data structures. I'm not sure if they are actually making ontologies for those, but what I mean to say is if you have so many different CSV files, the concepts that are in there are going to be all over the place. Like ID, okay, all databases have IDs, product IDs, paint IDs, lots of IDs, but it doesn't end there. There are even things that are concepts that are very clear concepts for the paint factory, but you don't know. And you will put them in a basket here, maybe in one you'll characterize them as something. So that's the first item, is that this in the first place will never be very accurate by definition. And the second is that what could help is not only looking at what the column name says, but you could actually look at the column contents. After all, you are also crawling these files, so you are looking at the data. But apparently, well, of course, it's going to be a computationally intensive task, but you could also look at what the data distributions are there, because people may have some stupid name for something. But when you look at the distribution, you might actually see, oh, there are country names. So it is country actually, or actually you don't even know what it is. But what could be interesting is saying, okay, oh, I've got 276 different columns in different CSV files, but they seem to be containing the same stuff. Don't know what it is, but it seems to be the same. So that is also something that could be interesting. So I would characterize this as a very first attempt, but you could go much further than that.
Much further,
yeah.
Absolutely. So that's also what we did the Sherlock project on, actually indeed building more intelligent, better approaches for this task. But you need labeled data to do so. And of course, you can also just make a vector representation of a concept and find similarities without even naming the concept. And then you could use that. And there, for that other model, we actually looked also at the column values, extracted features from that, and then mapped it to these concepts. But still filtering on column names. So we're not looking for an exhaustive annotation here, just some annotations I still think it's pretty high quality, although these types may not be relevant within all domains and not covering all these domains based on these ontologies. I do think that by having a very strict matching only on the column names, those samples that we have, those columns that we have of those types, can be quite reliable in the sense that email addresses that are named as email addresses with a column name email, we can pretty depend on that actually being the case, so that those columns actually present email addresses.
Sure.
But this is definitely our first basic attempt to provide these annotations, and we hope that these annotations on this scale provide actually a corpus to actually improve this whole task of table understanding, for example. And this is also, so we have a few things. So we of course release all these tables, and some of them are accompanied by annotations. And I'm also eager to try out different ontologies, for example, because these are, indeed pretty specific or very general. But I'm also interested in, for example, I just came across an enterprise knowledge graph, which may have actually more relevant types to enhance this table with. But I think we can do much more indeed to really come to a very high quality annotated table data set.
Sure.
Did you try to predict the column name instead of the type? So for that you have labeled data, right?
I'm sorry?
For the column name, did you try to predict that one? Because there you have labeled data, right?
So we use the column name actually.
As the label.
Yeah, if they match one of our types.
No, I'm just thinking, you're saying that it's a difficult task because you don't really have labeled data for the concepts?
Or we could use web tables, for example, but then we don't, we found that it doesn't really generalize that well to corpora outside of the web domain, for example. So we could use such a model that was trained on a different corpus to make predictions of these types and add them. But for now, we only look indeed at the column names and do some exact matching with column names based on the types that we have in our ontology.
So you meant that if the column name was missing, that you could predict it. Yeah, that you could do probably.
Oh yeah, definitely. So that's something that we want this corpus to facilitate actually, to do that. But we don't train a model to indeed in some kind of semi-supervised way also annotate tables that are unlabeled at the moment. No, we just generate these labels as a first step to this. Yeah.
But your corpus does contain tables without column names.
Yeah, absolutely. Many of them. Yeah. So it's mainly about getting a new set of tables and making a first attempt to annotate them. Yeah, so on to indeed what we now actually have built. So we keep on extracting tables from GitHub. This is an ongoing process. It's currently a bit stuck. I'm not sure what the problem is, but we have at the moment more than 7 million tables, or well, CSV files. But we released the first version of GitTables in June 2021. And this version consists of 1.7 million tables, of which 1 million to 1.5 million, depending on the actual ontology, are actually annotated with at least one annotation per table. So indeed, not all these tables are annotated. And it also depends on the type of annotation method that we used, how many tables are annotated. So for example, with the syntactic matching based on the column name, we only have 1 million labeled tables, let's say, 1 million tables with at least one annotation. But with the semantic approach, we have a bit more because that's a bit more, less precise in that sense. We have a pretty broad coverage in terms of the semantic types. So we have roughly 1,000 types, diverse, distinct types across these tables. And we also made a semantic type detection benchmark dataset, assuming that these like syntactic matches are accurate. We also release a smaller dataset of 1,000 tables that we actually manually reviewed also for benchmarking semantic type detection methods. A bit more into the content of these tables. So of course, we looked at the table sizes. So for example, as I mentioned already, web tables are pretty small. Now, on average, they have 3 columns and 12 rows. In GitTables, although the tails are pretty long, both sides. So we also have many smaller tables with, for example, less than 2 rows and 2 columns. But on average, we have 25 columns per table and 209 rows. And there the question is, what should it look like? Well, at least it seems to be a different kind of corpus for now. So we're also considering to filter out some of these small tables. For example, if we have just one row or 1 column, we might wonder, okay, what do we want to have that in our corpus or not? And something other that we checked was whether these data characteristics are truly different. So when you really look into the column values, if these are really different from column values that you find in web tables. So I trained a model to detect data shift. So I labeled columns from, both VisNet, which mostly consists of web tables. VisNet is just a different corpus consisting of different web table collections, but predominantly web tables. So I added columns from that corpus and columns from GitTables. The label that we're trying to predict here is what the source repository is. So either it's GitTables or VisNet. And then we train a model to predict for each column whether it comes from GitTables or from VisNet. And this model is actually very accurate. So in 90% of the cases, 90% of the columns, we can accurately say, okay, this column came from VisNet or this column comes from GitTables. And we extracted roughly 1,000 very low level features from these columns.
So that means that there is a big shift.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, indeed. And these features are, for example, character count. So how many dots appear in these values, or all kinds of counts for every character, basically, and all statistics, so means, standard deviations, and so on, all aggregated across columns, but also word embeddings, for example, which fill for numerical data, of course. So that might also give some indication there. In terms of topical coverage, so we looked at the semantic types that were annotated using these methods for GitTables. We compared that to the semantic types from DBpedia for web tables. Web tables has also been associated with, for example, DBpedia and schema.org. And we find that there's only a 40% overlap, which is still pretty something, in the top 10 DBpedia types from web tables versus GitTables. And that indicates some different semantic distribution that we have across these tables. Interestingly, the most common type in GitTables is the ID type, which makes sense and which is something that we're happy about. The most common type in web tables is the name type, while the ID type actually falls much beyond the top 20 types in web tables. And this indicates that there's just a different semantic distribution of web tables compared to GitTables, which to me makes sense, but of course that's also to all of you database architecture people to judge that.
Two short questions, if I may.
Yeah.
So you said like the most frequent column type is Git is ID for the Git table.
Yeah.
But you said like you were looking for CSV files by identifying them as CSV files and having ID in there, or was that only for your sample?
That was only for the example there to illustrate indeed that it was a good data source to check out.
Mm-hmm.
But we query for all topics in WordNet. So for example, object, population ID, entity, and dwarf, many different very specific or very general concepts. We use that to inform these queries indeed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Second, what is the largest table you encountered so far in terms of rows or columns or both?
Oh, I didn't check.
The graph ends at 3,000.
Yeah, I squeezed it a little bit in because there are really long tails.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure what in terms of the total number of cells. I think I would then check that, but I have no idea. So the problem with GitHub is that's just one challenge is that the file sizes are limited to 400 kilobytes. So we don't have massive tables.
Could you also check for csv.gz?
No.
No.
Maybe I should. That's a good one, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good one. Maybe that will give us a bit
some bigger
large.
ones.
Yeah, absolutely. That's different. I think GitHub in general is a very rich data source for all kinds of data sets to build. Also, GitDB schema. Well, we'll come to that, but yeah, very rich data source, and eager to also check out such extensions and file formats. Continuing to some use cases. Semantic type detection, column type detection, of course. So our task here is that given the table, we want to say, okay, this first column here matches to IDs. Of course, these can be very different IDs within different companies, but at least these map to an ID. The third column would be mapped to age. And the fourth maybe mapped to the type rating. Our goal here is to normalize these types across different tables to see if they can be integrated, for example. Our approach here is that we take 10,000 columns from Visnet. Visnet, again, it mostly contains tables from web tables. And we take 10,000 columns from GitTables. All these 10,000 columns correspond to the same 5 semantic types: name, address, and 3 more. I don't remember. So we have the same semantics, but just different tables. We extract, again, those 1,000 features from all these columns, and we train a very simple random forest classifier to detect these semantic types per column. We then train this model on a source corpus here in this table. For Visnet, if we evaluate it on columns from Visnet, we get a very accurate F1 score, very accurate model, which, I mean, all these table models so far have really surprisingly good performance on table understanding. I think the current performance is around 0.95, something like that in F1 score, and that's just very good. But if you then train such a model on GitTables, you see that the performance really lowers, which is a good thing because then it's actually more challenging to do that for GitTables. So also researchers building table models now have a more challenging data set. But still, with GitTables, you're able to train such a model. So that's good. Something that we're also interested in is to see, okay, to confirm or, test this hypothesis that Langenecker et al. Introduced, that these models trained on VisNet or web tables don't generalize well to, for example, a public BI benchmark. We check the generalizability from VisNet to GitTables, and we see that it generalizes much less. So there's definitely some kind of data shift, which confirms here as well.
Good that you know about the public benchmark, but yeah. Different question though.
Mm-hmm.
So this experiment here, where you train models, then you do look at the data values.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So all these features are extracted from column values.
Okay.
Not the, so we ignore the header column names.
So you could have here, you could have used that score of 82% to provide a label column name for the tables that you don't have column names for.
Yes, we could do that. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But so that's I think that's definitely interesting to do. If we then still say about these annotations,
you have to tell the people that this is not the original value.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I think it would actually make sense to include the original header as well.
Yeah, we do that as well. Yeah, so we
didn't look at that.
Yeah, we simply just distribute the table in Parquet files with metadata where these annotations are, for example, provided, but also like the original URL of these CSV files, licenses, and some other metadata of these tables.
Where they came from, I hope.
Yeah.
In which repository, because that's actually very important information.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So that's, I think that can be used for many different cases as well. But also to check, for example, if a table still exists, because if it doesn't exist, maybe we should also remove it from the corpus. But yeah, that's something that I personally don't want to commit to at this moment, to do that, always. So this is at the moment just, if someone asks, we delete it. That's the idea. But that's what you can use it for, or informing, these file names, for example, of these CSV files may be informative as well, to infer, for example, what these tables in general are about. Another use case, actually inspired by the web tables paper from Cavarella et al., header autocompletion. Apparently, database designers are supported by getting header completions. I think this is also relevant for example, data discovery, or also knowledge base enhancement, where if given an initial set of attributes or column names, what's relevant to add to a table as well. That's the basic task that we have here. So given the column name, ID, and company, you may want to add a column order, ID, and value as a suggestion. So our approach here is we take 16,000 unique headers from GitTables. We embed these headers column-wise, so per column name. We embed these columns using the Google's Universal Sentence Encoder. This is more accurate because it's actually built for also multiple word column names, as some might compose of different words. And then we look at the closest distance between this initial header prefix and the header prefixes of the same length of all these headers in GitTables. Here in this table at the right, you can actually see the results. So a few suggestions. If you have a prefix of payment ID and customer ID, you get a suggestion, review ID, product parent, product title, which within this context seem reasonable suggestions, informative, perhaps helpful for a database designer. Then a second example is ID and company. You get a very specific suggestions here, but if you look at the semantics of it, it may make sense. It's just also a very initial model for this use case. So this can also be much better, of course, but just to illustrate what you can use it for, you get the suggestions: receivable payment header, receivable payment, status, customer, bank entity, bank account number. May be relevant. Actually, these headers are much larger in reality, but I had to squeeze in a bit and get only the few first suggestions of this specific headers. Last example, ID, name, and location. So much more personal information. You get also more like PII attributes as suggestions: phone, email, a unique identifier, and so on. This is like a very first experiment that I worked on this week. But to me, it seems, yeah, reasonable, but definitely can be improved. Well, we released this first version actually in June 2021. Already it has been downloaded for, well, individual data sets. So we released this corpus in 10 different data sets. They have been downloaded for 532 times up to today, a total of 1.2 terabytes. This benchmark data set for semantic column type detection has been featured in SemTab, which is a challenge for table to knowledge graph matching. And there the participants also found that it was very challenging to match these tables to knowledge graphs. And that's mainly because most of these methods within the semantic web community rely on, for example, knowledge bases to do entity linking. So looking at the column values, linking it to some entity in Wikipedia, for example, Wikidata, and then based on a majority voting rule, classifying these columns as a certain type. For GitTables, that's, well, often not possible because there's not such a match with one of those knowledge graphs. So that's a very new challenge that, that they encounter. It also inspired new work for data sets from GitHub. For example, GitDB schemas from Till Deumen, which is, I think, known here as well, together also with Sebastian Schelter. This is a very interesting data set also with table schemas, extractors from SQL files, also from GitHub, and this can be useful, for example, for key detection. Then there's also ongoing work that I'm aware of for extracting benchmark data sets for data discovery methods, among others from University of Michigan that I know, and the TU Delft. I'm not sure if the TU Delft is still working on it, but at the University of Michigan they are. This is also very interesting because I think data discovery is a very hot topic at the moment in research land. So yeah, that's really nice. And of course, now that I'm also at Sigma, we use GitTables ourselves to build table representation models for example, data search. But I think there are many opportunities ahead. Well, you can see here when you just search for CSV files on GitHub, you get more than 90 billion CSV files that are existing here. Our aim is to have at least 10 million tables, but yeah, I think we should just go for getting them all and keep on extracting these tables. Yeah, I'm also interested to see if we can map GitTables to other ontologies, for example, enterprise-specific ontologies, instead of more web-informed technology ontologies. Sorry. Or maybe we can just infer ontologies from GitTables if we find a good method for doing that. And then, as posed by Gerard Bijkoen during the VLDB keynote from 2021, he suggested also to use alternative data sources to enhance knowledge bases, as web corpora have been saturated also. And I just wonder if GitTables may be an interesting data source to check out if we can enrich this, for example, using header auto-completion to inform different attributes to add to certain pages in these knowledge bases. And of course, I'm also interested in more database informed applications like cardinality estimation. I think that's very interesting to see how we can actually learn from the semantics of these tables to inform also proper estimates for that. And perhaps you also have other ideas, maybe even from DocDB, I don't know. I listed some resources. I will share these slides also. If you're interested in the paper on archive, we build a website also, and all these data sets are linked for downloads. To summarize, well, I presented GitTables, which is a large-scale corpus of relational tables from GitHub. We've shown that GitTables better resembles typical database tables, and that is effective for tasks like header autocompletion, semantic type detection. We've shown how GitHub is a very rich source for creating data sets within the data management community. And we've seen some of the opportunities for creating, for example, benchmarks, enhancing knowledge bases, and building table models. With that, I'd like to thank you all. Please reach out if you have new ideas for use cases or if you have comments or questions. But thank you.
Thanks so much.
So let's stop the recording. Okay.
You don't want the questions on tape.
No.